Okay, hello, folks. Welcome to Five Ways Housing Racism Reshaped Los Angeles. So the point of this is to highlight Black History Month and to go through the ways in history that have ultimately disproportionately affected Black people. And so I think it's really important. Some of this you may have heard. Hopefully, there's some of it that you haven't. But it's really to explore the history of housing from the perspective and from sort of looking at how it affects Black people. There will also be some information in there around some important figures in housing history. And so I'm going to go over that as well. But before we start, we have to do a land acknowledgement. So I did mine based on where I'm living. I live in the Pico Union neighborhood, and that is the zip code of 90006. And there are the lands of the Tongva and excuse me, sorry for mispronouncing, Gabrielino people. Abundant Housing LA recognizes and acknowledges the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva Gabrielino people and lands that is now occupied by State Senate District 26 and City Council District 1. Again, this is for where I'm living at. We acknowledge and honor Indigenous folks, elders, past and present, and the descendants. We recognize that the Tongva peoples are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and communities. Prior to 1492, Native peoples ensured every member of the community had a home. We share a fundamental human responsibility to ensure that as the people who came after, we can say the same. So if you're interested in learning more about where you're living and sort of like what lands there are, and if you live anywhere in LA, it's probably some of the same, but I recommend going to native-land.ca. And if you want to learn more about the Tongva people and the Gabrielino tribe, I've got that link there, and I can send this to folks afterward if you need. So let's talk about Abundant Housing LA for a second. So our mission is to address the upstream causes of the housing crisis and housing shortage and build a movement for structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. So why is abundant housing so important? Well, a couple of the things, there are many, but we'll just address two today. Abundant housing is important for more affordable housing. Multifamily apartment buildings are cheaper per unit than single family homes, but even though so many people need a place to live, most of LA is still zoned for housing scarcity through low density suburban sprawl. That can look like zoning for single family homes, that can look like height limits, that can look like yard setbacks, parking minimums, things of that nature. Another thing is abundant housing is important because it addresses racial and economic inequality. White supremacy created exclusionary single family zoning and then sold it to the public as the American dream. More housing density means more diversity and neighbors. So we seek to achieve abundant housing through advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture around housing. And we hope that you'll like to be a part of this effort. You'll see that here I have a picture of what we have our core for as Abundant Housing LA. These are the 4 things that we strive toward, all with the foundation of promoting racial justice and equity. That's legalizing more homes, making homes easier to build, fund affordable housing and end homelessness, as well as strengthening renters' rights. So now let's get into the 5 ways housing racism reshaped Los Angeles. So let's get to it, starting with redlining. I know we've probably all heard of this before, but here's a quick description. The Great Depression led to lots of people defaulting on home loans and losing their homes to foreclosure in some cases. And the government responded to that by creating the National Housing Act in 1934, and with that, the Federal Housing Authority. So with that National Housing Act, the Federal Housing Authority, or you might hear it referred to as the FHA, it insures mortgages made by private lenders to protect against loan defaults. And then along with that was created the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, or FSLIC, which provided deposit insurance to savings and loan institutions, right? So this is basically to help people, but it's really only helping a certain amount of people. We're not really talking about Black people, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then to follow that up, there was the 1937 Wagner and Stigl Act, or Housing Act of 1937, and that established the United States Housing Administration responsible for building publicly subsidized housing. Federal government provided funding, but ownership and operation of the housing was of the local public housing authority appointed by local elected officials. And basically what that means is leaving operational decisions up to the local authorities. We talk a lot about how regions, cities, neighborhoods have local control. And I think that this is one of those things that established that, or helped to establish it anyway. And so with that, it allowed basically for communities that did not want affordable housing or public housing, it allowed them the opportunity to say, no, that you can't have this here. So they could determine the project's location, virtually guaranteeing that housing projects would remain racially segregated. And with that, the Housing Act of 1937 also set a very low maximum income requirement for public housing residents. And this policy was intended to alleviate fears that public housing would compete with the private market. But it ultimately led to high concentrations of poverty within public housing projects. So let's talk a little bit about some of the impact of redlining. Redlined or red tagged areas suffer more persistent residential segregation. That might look like single family homes, right? So that might look like the sort of thing where you just can't afford to buy it because those have such a high cost. And you'll see that in Los Angeles, there are quite a few places that were redlined or red tagged that are now very much single family home zone, right? And so it's sort of like zoning became a tool to use after redlining would no longer be available. So cities where more of these high risk graded areas with redlining termed hazardous, or the actual redlined areas, are mostly associated with hypersegregation. So that's to say that both Black and Hispanic residents of hypersegregated cities are unevenly distributed and have lower levels of interaction with non-Hispanic whites. Minority residents also tend to be more clustered in neighborhoods of cities where there were more of that higher risk or red line type neighborhood. Persistent economic inequality. There's significantly greater economic inequality in those areas that were redlined. To a lesser extent, this is also true for other cities where more of the there was more of the desirable type neighborhood. But this could indicate that cities with less change in the racial and ethnic structure of their neighborhoods over the past 80 years have great economic equality today. And then to go along with that is gentrification. A lot of the times it's masked as other things, or maybe it even comes in with good intent, right? But sometimes that can be associated with greater economic change, especially in hazardous areas, which are the ones that are most likely to attract some sort of renewal or some sort of what ends up being gentrification, and also can result in displacement. That's sort of a thing that happens. And so that is another impact of these actual red-lined areas. And then to follow up with that, there's other things like high levels of pollution. There's a lower tree canopy, so it's hotter in those areas. And so those are some of the impacts of redlining, and there's even more than that we could get in deeper. But in general, in essence, I think that what's important here to say is that redlined neighborhoods have the highest share of Black residents, right? So when we talk about, in a little bit, we'll talk about ways how sort of like Black folks were really confined to these redlined areas or red tagged areas. We see that. We see the truth there. We see that in the data of the population. Next, let's talk a little bit about Article 34. So Article 34 which came through in 1950, was passed after a legal dispute over a proposed federally funded public housing project in the city of Eureka. And local residents were like, no, we don't want that project. We don't want it here. And they attempted to stop it by passing a referendum. However, the California Supreme Court found in favor of the city, reasoning that a referendum can only apply to a legislative act, and that the city public housing authority's application for federal money was an administrative act. So they were like, no, no, sorry, you can't do anything about this. In the wake of the defeat, the public housing opponents changed tactics and organized a campaign to amend the California Constitution, basically saying that we will be able to discriminate who we want to discriminate against. And it did appeal to racist fears about integrating neighborhoods, right? Sort of thing where it's like, okay, well, I mean, hey, there's going to be like some Black folks and some other, people of color, though that's not what they were referred to in those times. Those people are going to be moving into your neighborhood. Like, we got to do something about that. No more public housing. And so this was ways people to combat that integration and to combat socialism, which socialism has got a bad rap, for a long time. And whether or not that's, true or accurate or what have you, this country has a big thing about being against socialism. I think it's maybe a big misunderstanding, but maybe that's for another day. But the article reads that no low rent housing project shall hereafter be developed, constructed, or acquired in any manner by any state public body until a majority or the qualified electors of the city, town, or country, as the case may be, in which it is proposed to develop, construct, or acquire the same, voting upon the issue, approve such project by voting in favor, which is blah, 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 and a lot of stuff to just basically tell you, yes, we want people to be able to vote and say no, right? So Article 34 finally came through after that issue in Eureka, and it weakened efforts to integrate in suburban communities, right? Because it allowed folks to be able to say, no, we don't want this kind of housing here. And you'll see that even when they were trying to create this Article 34, this was the sort of thing that they used for marketing, right? It's like, it's your American right to vote. And this was Prop 10, which actually sort of led to Article 34. But this was the sort of rhetoric that they were advertising with, that it's a matter of democracy, that you have the right to vote. But what they're not really saying on these things, at least not in big type, is that, but the idea is we want to give you the power to not allow the people that you don't want in your neighborhood. Another thing that happened, highway construction. Now, this is a big one, especially in LA, because we have our freeways and, there's a lot of discussion about why a freeway is necessary, right? But this is sort of what it looked like when they started to mow through and create these highways. So Congress approved the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, and it was a law that promised to construct 41,000 miles of an ambitious interstate highway system that would crisscross the nation, dramatically expanding America's roadways and connecting 42 state capital cities and 90% of all American cities with populations of over 50,000. So the goal was to eliminate unsafe roads, inefficient routes, and traffic jams that impede fast and safe cross-country travel. So according to the estimates, though, from the US Department of Transportation, more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide because of the federal roadway construction. Highways cut through neighborhoods, darkened and disrupted the pedestrian landscape, worsened air quality, and really negatively affected property values, right? So the idea, there was lots of loss of small businesses that provided jobs and kept money circulating locally, which was crucial to middle-class footholds in areas already struggling from like racist zoning policies, right? And so these are pictures of Los Angeles. I do believe that this is the, what is it, the 110? Oh no, I'm horrible with, I don't drive, excuse me. I'm horrible with directions and I don't know going which way, so well. But yes, I believe this is the Santa Monica Freeway that we're looking at in these pictures here. And this is when they started to tear through these homes to be able to create these highways. And so the neighborhoods destroyed and families uprooted by highway projects were largely Black and poor. That was by design. Policymakers and planners saw highway construction as a convenient way to plow through desirable or undesirable and blighted neighborhoods. And they deployed this massive infrastructure elements of like multi-lane road beds, concrete walls, ramps, and overpasses. And these were all tools of segregation. They were used as physical buffers to isolate communities of color. You might actually see that in some cases there was like a white side and a black side sort of thing. And it's like, well, here's a freeway, so that way you can be separated and safe from the dangerous Black people. That's the sort of rhetoric and things that they were saying about that. I do just want to pay attention to the chat. Let's see, and Valerie says, and for the Army to be able to move heavy artillery. Yep, and asked, is it true that the federal government wanted freeways so they could move military equipment if needed? I'm actually unsure about that, but I don't see why that wouldn't be a thing that they would need, especially during like after wartime and wanting to be able to move people around and like defense, I don't know, products and things like that. I imagine that could be a thing. And so, yeah, this is another picture here that just depicts the construction of the freeways. And you see all these places around there, this was filled with homes and businesses. What was on this? Here we go. So why one of the biggest sort of impacts with highway construction had to do with a rather, I don't know, it was a region that housed sort of the Black elite. It was called West Adam Heights, or nicknamed Sugar Hill. And so folks that were like, in like film and other things like that, like Ray Charles, Little Richard, Pearl Bailey, and Hattie McDaniel moved into these areas, right? And so this was becoming an integrated neighborhood with Black folks that had money. Hattie McDaniel was the first Black actress to win an Oscar. She was in Gone with the Wind. And she was instrumental in a legal protection against racially restrictive covenants. And that's Hattie McDaniel there, right? But unfortunately, the highway construction plowed right through West Adams Heights. Fortunately, Hattie McDaniel's house is still there, and so that exists as a sort of monument, a historical monument, but still, that they decided that, okay, well, Black people are moving into this area, so let's put a highway through it, right? Let's discourage, excuse me, I don't know why I don't know that word all of a sudden, but let's disencourage people from, or especially Black people, from moving here. And if they're going to move here, then we're going to use this as a space that will drive through those neighborhoods and keep it from becoming something more. So let's talk about sort of these negative consequences of highway construction. Economic depression, something that we mentioned on the previous slide, right? When businesses are closed and sort of run through, then there's not that sort of like money exchange that happens in the area anymore. And so people were losing their jobs and didn't have money to do things with. With those areas, they became known as slums, a lot of them, especially if they were close to other redlined areas. And so there was that lack of investment there. And it reinforced segregation, like I said before. It was used as a barrier. It was something that, quote unquote, protected people from, the other foreigners, particularly Black people. And so that's an issue. Next, we have urban renewal. So this here, the pictures that are on the screen, this is actually Bunker Hill. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind. Urban renewal is the process of seizing and demolishing large swaths of private and public property for the purpose of modernizing and improving aging infrastructure. Between 1949 and 1974, the US government underwrote this process through a Department of Housing and Urban Development grant and loan program. And although the money was federal, renewal plans originated with and were implemented at the local level. So this is something that we're seeing a lot, right? We're seeing that every time there's something that maybe could be used for good, it's left up to local control. And there are people that are like, no, I don't really want to do that for that, right? I don't want to do that to advocate for or to increase sort of into the number of folks in integrated neighborhoods, right? I don't really want to do that. And so Bunker Hill was like arguably one of Los Angeles's first super diverse neighborhoods, right? It was like one of the most heterogeneous neighborhoods that existed. It was kind of vibrant, you know, and it had its whole thing going on, and it was a great place for lots of folks, including people of color, including Black folks. And we flattened it. That's what we did. We flattened it. And what's there now is what is the Civic Center that's there now in downtown, right? And they sort of flattened it out and got rid of all that and just sort of washed it. And it's really sad because unless you really are looking for that information, or I guess happen to just come across it, you would have no idea. I don't know how many times I was in downtown LA and had no idea that this was like a crazy, amazing, vibrant place that had a really, really big, diverse population. And I feel like there are some things that in downtown LA that are very much like staples of downtown LA. We know where the Civic Center is. We know where all those things are down there. But it's sad to realize that there were a lot of folks that were displaced from there, and it was I don't know, destroyed to create for something new that didn't necessarily give any sort of equitability or thought to people that are marginalized, low income and otherwise, especially Black people, right? So that's sort of how urban renewal was used. It was supposed to allow cities to make things better, right? To go into these sort of blighted or undesirable areas that we've mentioned previously, right? They were meant to go into these and improve them. And maybe they did improve them, but maybe they also just sort of like washed everything out and started over, or replaced it with things that, you know, the people that were living there previously just didn't have the ability to purchase or be a part of, right? And so urban renewal sounds great, not so great in practice if you're not approaching it with an equitable approach, right? And finally, the last of the five is state-sanctioned violence. How did this reshape Los Angeles, you wonder? Well, Black people are moving into the homes on the edge or just outside of redlined areas. They were attacked, right? And you'll see this quote from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that says that there were cross burnings and dynamite bombings, rocks thrown through windows, graffiti, and other acts of vandalism, as well as numerous phone threats. And that was titled, I guess you could call it, move-in violence for folks that were moving in. But it extended beyond just the move-in date, right? It was the sort of thing that happened a lot. And there was never anything that was really done about it. And so what's interesting about that is that there are records of this sort of thing. So Judge Lauren Miller, who earlier I mentioned that Hattie McDaniel had a case where she was sued because she moved into an area in West Adam Heights. And the people that were living there were like, nah, you can't because there's a racially restrictive covenant. Well, Judge Lauren Miller, although that time he was an attorney and not a judge, helped her in winning that case. And then also was part of a testimony before the governor's commission on the Los Angeles riots. And so I found this really interesting. It's digitized records, and so I hope you can see it okay. But in this, he is talking about how the density of every area that is even a little bit considered sort of a Negro area, that the density had increased. And he's saying that because of the great difficulty that Black folks experience in trying to purchase outside of those redlined areas. He goes on to say, most of you know too, there's been a great deal of racial conflict, including one bombing in the city several years ago, where Negroes have moved into what are commonly thought of as white areas. So actually, there was a family that was killed from that sort of bombing, right? They moved in, I believe it was a mother and a child. I'm not sure of the details, but I know that there was at least a mother and a child, and they were killed because their place got bombed after they moved into it. And Lauren Miller goes on to say, unfortunately, police have been unable to solve any of these crimes. There's only been one prosecution that he knows of, and he keeps up with that sort of thing, right? In another part, he says that in 1947, a Black person was arrested and put in jail because he wanted to occupy his own home on East 92nd Street, east of Central Avenue. And because of the way things sort of like fell, there were some white folks around the area in South LA. And so there's a real sort of like confined area there. And this guy's home was like maybe just on the border of it. And so he got arrested. It was his own home, but people didn't want him there. And so when we talk about state-sanctioned violence, when the police are A, not doing anything about any of this stuff that's happening, and then B, arresting folks because they want to occupy their own home, that is state-sanctioned violence. That is an entire institution that is coming down on you and saying that we don't really care about what happens to you. You can't be anywhere outside where we want you to be. That's a big issue. How traumatic that must have been, right? And how scary. Lauren Miller says, like, now Watts, or what we call Watts, is a particular product of judicial enforcement. It was ringed on every side by highly restricted areas. The Southwest Realty Board particularly worked in season and out to confine Black folks to the traditional Watts. And so when people are like, yeah, you know, I am going to spread out. I'm not going to just remain here because they tell me to, they were met with lots of violence. And no one really ever did anything about it, right? As Judge Lauren Miller said, there was one prosecution, but there were so many other instances of this sort of thing. So I want to talk to you about, a lot of that was kind of, dark and sad, and it's terrible history and something that we have to work toward undoing, right? And untangling those sort of white supremacy and racist knots that are in our history of housing. But I want to point out some of the folks that have done some of the work, that have consistently in the history of housing done things that really helped us. And so this is Charlotta Bass. Some of you may have already heard about her. She probably came up a lot when Vice President Kamala Harris was going into office. But this is Charlotta Bass, and she was interesting because she was the owner and editor of a Black newspaper. It was called the California Eagle, and she used it as a forum for social justice issues. She was not afraid to put on the cover that, hey, this kind of thing is happening in Watts. There's riots, or there's some sort of attack or violence on Black people. She did that, and she advocated for better housing. She campaigned for a city council district, and she ran for vice president. It was a third party ticket, right? So it was a progressive third party, but they named her vice president, and she ran. So that's amazing. She did what she needed to do to really get the information out there. I think at its peak, there was something like a quarter of the Black population in Los Angeles was subscribed to the newsletter. And that was something around 17,000 folks. That's a lot back then. And so I think that it's really important to mention her. These are some of the stills, or I said screenshots or what have you, of her newspaper. This one in particular is actually covering another option, case that was used to uphold Shelley versus Kramer, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it was a thing that basically outlawed legally enforcing racially restricted covenants, right? Which were property deeds that said no Black person or non-white person actually can ever live here. But again, it used terms like Negro, foreigner, Orientals, things like that. Just really terrible language. But these are the things that Charlotta Bass made sure she put on her newspaper. She wanted to get this information around, and there was advocacy and organizing that came from this sort of thing. In addition to Charlotta Bass, I need to mention again, I've mentioned him a couple of times now, but there's Lauren Miller. He was a lawyer and a judge, and he helped Hattie McDaniel win the case against her. And again, using sort of these other things that set a precedent for whether or not people would be able to somehow get racially restrictive covenants enforced. He helped solidify that as like, no, racially restrictive covenants cannot be legally enforced. So he was pretty instrumental in that, and that's him right there. There he is, Judge Lauren Miller. And the last person that, well, it's not a person actually, it's a group that I want to highlight is the Long Beach Fair Housing Foundation, or the FHF. And this was great because it was in response to Prop 14, and Prop 14 basically restored the ability to discriminate in housing. That was the long and the short of it, right? And so when that happened, obviously the people most affected by that are Black folks. And so the FHF formed with a mission, quote, devoted entirely to the promotion of fair and open housing practices in our community, and to act as a clearinghouse and work with all persons interested in fair housing to carry on a continuing educational campaign, to function as a fact-finding agency, and to maintain a working committee of volunteers available. So I think I was like, wow, like I was so amazed when I came across this information, because all of this is research that I've done, right? So this was a foundation made completely up of Black women, and they all worked for free. They volunteered 30 hours a week. And even after they got enough money from private donations and subscriptions for the newsletter and things like that, the money went toward leasing an office space, and the women continued to work and volunteer their time. And within 10 months of operation, they increased the number of families of color living in integrated neighborhoods from 8 to 33. And by 1969, the number grew to 160. And so in 1966, the Navy decommissioned its yard in Brooklyn, New York, and it actually moved its naval officers, including Black folks, to the Long Beach yard. And so with that, the foundation was flooded not only with local families of color seeking help, but veterans of color amping up the foundation's efforts and tactics. Now, this is the part I was like, oh man, like this is something interesting. And I like to see this sort of advocacy and fight for social justice. These tactics included testing, which involved sending a white person to see if a house was available. And if it was, then sending a Black person with the same qualifications to see how differently they were treated. And then in addition to that, there was a method called double escrow, which involved opening 2 different escrows to 2 different parties, one white and one Black, on the same property on the same day, to see which one would be processed more efficiently. And the reason they were doing that was to build up legal ammunition, because by 1967, it actually might have been 66, I'm not sure, Prop 14 was declared unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment. And at that point, Long Beach led the way by winning 6 more cases of housing discrimination, because of the legal ammunition that the FHF had built up. And I think that is an amazing story, and I'm really happy that I got to be able to include that in this presentation. So what are some solutions to this sort of thing, right? We're hearing that a lot of our housing history is laced with very discriminatory racist practices. If you even look, you might have heard how, if you're looking at the numbers of homelessness, that Black folks are overrepresented, which is to say that these are not proper numbers, but just as an example, say Black people are 15% of the population, right? Then they are somehow 30% of the unhoused population. And that is what it means for them to be overrepresented. They only exist as 15% of our full population, but somehow make up maybe close to half of the unhoused population. Ideally, we would have no one who's unhoused, right? But if we wanted to say, well, there's no sort of discriminatory reason for this sort of thing, what you might find then instead is that if Black people are 15% of the total population, then they should also only be 15% of the unhoused population. And that's sort of where that becomes a discrepancy, okay? So with that, there are some things, there's the affirmatively, excuse me, furthering fair housing, which is to help undo those sort of patterns of segregation. It makes it so that way you have to determine who lacks access to opportunity and address any inequity among protected class groups, promote integration and reduce segregation, transform racially and ethically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. You might see some of this in your city's housing elements, because these are things that are part of that now. It might, I know that there's one recently, and I won't call out the city name, but there was one recently that I read that said that they didn't bother to give a proper count of the needs of all the people in that city, right? And so that one had more to do with families or number of families in the area, but that is the sort of thing you want to look at housing elements. You want to look at all of these things that we're doing to try to get more housing and make sure that it's doing so in an equitable way. So you'll want to send comments to HCD, which is the Housing and Community Development, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and contact your local representatives. Like sometimes it seems like, are they the ones that are doing anything? But I think if we can get people educated and aware of these sort of issues, and so contacting your representative, they may not know anything about it or not know that there's a way that they can get involved. I think it's really just important to let the folks that are making decisions for us know how we feel and what we want. Another thing that you can do is Abundant Housing LA. We got stuff. You know, we're still working on you know, making sure that we're always equitable in all of our choices and our strategies. So, you know, join our Housing Advocates Council. It and its subcommittees will provide input on key decisions made by Abundant Housing LA. The council members help set the policies and our political agenda, determining what housing issues to focus on and how to achieve affordable housing for all. Now, like I said, there are the subcommittees, and we have a Racial Justice and Equity Committee, one that I am on. And with that, we meet to decide, excuse me, what are our goals for racial justice and equity, and how are we going to actually achieve those, right? How are we going to implement this sort of affirmatively furthering fair housing into our everyday work? And so if you'd like to be a part of that, definitely please join our Housing Advocates Council and make noise about wanting to join the Racial Justice and Equity Committee. So that's sort of the end of my presentation here, but I just put some stuff up here if you'd like to sign up for the Abundant Housing LA newsletter. If you want to join our council, I've got some stuff here. I could definitely share this slide deck with you folks if you're interested in that. But now I'd kind of like to just hear from you folks a little bit. Like, is there anything that you'd like to add to this conversation? Is there anything you have questions about? I don't know if I'll have the answers, but I'd love to hear from anybody who's here. So if you want to say something in the chat, or I can even allow folks to speak. So let me stop sharing now. Okay. Oh, and here we go. Valerie put something in the chat saying state government trying to make it right now, undoing the past. Lawmakers seek to mend California neighborhoods sliced by highways. Right. And so that is a great thing to bring up. Thank you so much for bringing that up. There are certain cities that are asking for descendants of displaced residents to come back. I know Santa Monica has a program like that. I'm not sure of other places. Excuse me. But yeah, that's something that's happening. Whether that's enough, you know, they're trying to make it right, but whether that's enough, we don't really know. We sort of have to follow that and see what it is. Especially in Santa Monica, I think that they're only able to accommodate up to 100, I believe it said. And so, you know, I mean, it's good, but it's not, you know, that has to work in concert with a lot of things, right? In order to be able to create this sort of equitable housing, to create integrated neighborhoods, which is a thing that we still want to create, right? Even today, we see how there are areas that are have those big discrepancies between the kind of people. If you go into South LA, it's mostly sort of Hispanic and Latino people, and then there's a couple of areas where Black folks are, but that is sort of disinvested area, right? And so we see that sort of thing. So when you also see that affordable housing is being built, think about where it's being built. Does it need to be built in, you know, the areas that are already sort of like lacking in investment, or where affordable housing already exists? Like, no, ideally, we'd like to get affordable housing in sort of the wealthier to do neighborhoods, right? We might want to put affordable housing in Santa Monica or in Brentwood or places like that. And whether or not the land supports that is another complicated issue. I do think that that is part of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is, again, not to confine people to this one area because of what they can afford, or because of whatever their circumstances are, or simply because they may be Black, right? That is just wrong. It's just wrong. And so some things to consider. I think I'm wondering if there's anyone else who has any questions or anything to add. I'd love to hear from y'all. I ended a little bit earlier than I expected. So I didn't quite time the presentation for a full like hour or hour and a half or whatever I have going on here. But yeah, does anyone have anything they'd like to add? Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for coming, and thank you everyone for coming today. This obviously is recorded, so we will upload it, and at some point, and we'll make sure that everyone can view this. And if people are interested, I'll send out the slide deck. But there's much more to learn, both on my part and for everybody. So this is just the tip of the iceberg for how we can create a better housing space for everybody in Los Angeles, and to get everyone housed, right? And in quality housing even. All right. Well, if there's no questions or anything, I just want to thank you all for attending, and thank you in the future to you watching at home on YouTube, wherever it will be uploaded. I appreciate it. And please reach out to me, Joshua at abundanthousingle.org. I am the education director at Abundant Housing LA. Not sure if I said that before. I kind of just jumped into the presentation. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Black History Month. That's what it's about. All right. So have a great one. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the best.